If you love movies and movie discussions, you've come to the right place. Who am I, you ask? I am the Wiz, and I'm here today with...
Zero.
Zero, how you doing this week?
A little exhausted from that project that I've been on, but It is what it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, when your project is selling your body for all sorts of money, I mean, I can imagine you being incredibly exhausted, so, yeah. All right, Zero, so we are here today to review the 2014 documentary Atari Game Over, directed by Zach Penn. Zero, I think one of the types of movies that gets a kind of a bad rap as being boring are movies based off of business. Some of the best movies I've seen, like Wall Street, Glengarry Glen Ross, are all set in businesses. But I want to talk to you specifically because Atari Game Over is about the video game business. But is there a certain thing about the video game business or just the video game creation that you think deserves to have its own documentary or feature film?
Ooh, that's a good one. I know personally, you had turned me on to a podcast called Business Movers.
Mm-hmm, yes.
That was part of a Wondery series. They had a fantastic 3-episode podcast about Nintendo.
Yes.
And it covered Nintendo's origins from the beginning, when they produced the arcade cabinet, a radar scope, all the way right up until the Nintendo 64. And then that's when the documentary sort of stopped. And I was just like, all right, so that's as far as we'll go in this podcast. So that's it, guys. For me, I think a movie about Nintendo pivoting from trying to go for the most technologically advanced consoles, which that part of Nintendo's life was the N64 and the GameCube, to moving towards a philosophy of using old vetted technology but trying to make games that are very, very fun to play on older technologies. So covering consoles like the Wii, the Wii U, the Switch currently, because I know that's one era that a lot of people seem to not understand too well, because there's a lot of like misnomers of, oh, well, Nintendo couldn't afford to get into the graphics arms race, and it's just something that is just kind of fundamentally a complete misunderstanding. It's just like, that's not Nintendo. Nintendo looks at stability. That is their primary focus. Their primary focus is, can we do something that is good and stable for the business? There's always so many misnomers about it, but I think a movie that kind of goes through that transition period, I think would be fantastic, especially if it's kind of like a stylized documentary. I think that would be fine too.
I think there's two things that I would actually like to see a movie or documentary about. The first is the reveal and the subsequent disaster of the Xbox One. I would love to know the story of the E3 reveal of that. Just the absolute cluster it was after that was revealed and what happened afterwards. Make Don Matrick the main character and make it a story of somebody who really thought he had everything, and then it just blew up in his face. The creation of a game might not be that interesting of a story, but Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is considered, still to this day, one of the best games of all time. And it's one that, it's like what we're going to discuss today, seems to have this kind of air of mythology around it. Yet, I don't think there's much about that story and how they got together and how the creation was. But that would be an incredibly fascinating documentary or even movie to create.
Chrono Trigger and the Xbox One failure, those would be very interesting documentaries. But man, oh man, I could see somebody really having fun with the Xbox One documentary, especially if they just went completely off the rails, just hyper stylized it and stuff like that. Especially like with some of the choice quotes that Don Matrick had. Like, I think the one piece of news that I was absolutely floored by the response was, I forget which publication was asking, but it was when it was revealed that the Xbox One would require internet connectivity in order to validate.
I know exactly where you're going.
Yes. And it was basically, hey, so a lot of U.S. soldiers and troops stationed all around the world, they have Xbox 360 consoles. They may be in situations where they might not have internet. How are you going to help our servicemen abroad? Well, there's the perfect console for them. It's the Xbox 360.
I know.
It's like, holy shit.
Oh, it was. Oh, man, I remember that like it was yesterday. Because when I heard that, I was like, "What?" Oh man, you. Ooh. But yeah, like, God, I can think about it now. Man, I might have a screenplay writing session to do. Holy crap. That sounds like a great idea for a movie. All right, so let's just get into it. Let's get into the review of Atari Game Over, directed by Zach Penn. But before that, let's get into the plot. And basically, the plot is this. It's about the legend of E.T. for the Atari 2600, it being buried in a landfill somewhere, and that someone seems to believe that they found where that landfill is, and they want to dig it up to see if it is true. And that's essentially the plot.
This documentary starts off kind of in the usual manner. It's about the exploration of the myth that E.T. was such a terrible and awful game that basically Atari just had to pretty much just liquidate the cartridges. But, well, with retailers not wanting the game because of just the reviews commenting that it was awful, that it was terrible, people returning their cartridges en masse to big box retailers and everything. The urban legend was always E.T. was just so awful that Atari just wanted to forget that the whole thing even existed, so they paid a landfill a small amount of money, less than it would be to just beg the retailers to just keep the carts on the shelves and attempt to sell them, and basically just had somebody dig up a hole, bury all this stuff into a hole, and then cover up the hole for it. So it explores that myth. It's interesting because before they get to the dig, they go into the background behind E.T., just some of the development details on what led to its development, so it becomes a miniature history lesson in Atari as a company as a whole. So you go over the origins of Atari, you go over the origins of some of the major players who were the focal point in the creation of E.T., including the lead programmer for the game. And then you have some other figures who end up kind of entering in the mix in this documentary. Figures like Ernest Cline behind the novel Ready Player One. You've also got a lot of background information from Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari. And then, of course, the aforementioned programmer, Howard Scott Warshaw. He is in this quite a lot because he was the main guy who was the person who did a lot of the coding for E.T.
The movie seems to center around three people. Joe Lewandowski, who is the person who's trying to get the dig started. You mentioned Ernest Cline, who is the author of Ready Player One. And then Howard Scott Warshaw. Of the three, I think one is actually worth the time, and the rest just seems like filler at this point. Specifically, I would say that the Howard Warshaw one is actually the better story of the three.
I think Warshaw's story is the strongest, especially with kind of the background on just how he got started at Atari and then eventually working their way to just how the E.T. project was sort of dropped into his lap. Steven Spielberg and a whole bunch of others were like, hey, we want you to make an E.T. game in 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And full disclosure for the listeners, my day job is actually with a game studio. I can't divulge who. But
oh my God, you
know.
revealed the secret, Zero. I can't do the pretend jobs anymore. God damn it. Okay, fine.
Well, I gotta be upfront with my disclosure, so...
Okay.
Because I would feel that it would be a conflict of interest if I didn't. But to give folks an idea on how modern video game development works, video games most certainly nowadays are not built within 5 weeks. I mean, if you can, holy cow, you might be a little bit inhuman, you might be a monster. Please take a break. Most video games, even indies, will take several months. That's to account for stuff like testing, revising and cleaning up code, finding exploits and bugs that might be game-breaking. There's just so much that's involved to just kind of put together a game and then get it ready for retail release in 5 weeks. That's an absolutely insane timeline.
Yeah, and that's something I would have liked to have seen more of with Warshaw's story in this. He does go over a little bit as the movie goes on, says like it was a really bad 5 weeks and what he had to do to get done. I would have liked to have known a little more detail on that specifically. I want to say like the other two stories are just kind of filler. Like they don't really feel like anything substantive, especially with the one with Ernest Cline. Like I don't understand why they had his story in there. Like what was the point of that? It just seemed like a reason to just have like, oh wow, here's some goofy kind of thing that's happening here. It's like I don't care. This I don't really give a shit about the story. Can we get to about Warshaw, please? I think as I was watching this film, I had a thought of how I would have probably done this if I was gonna make it this a feature film. How I would do this, and it would basically, I would just center the entire story around Warshaw. I wouldn't even bother with the other two. I would have been like, okay, keep it on Warshaw. Go from when he was in Atari, talk about that, to now where he is built himself up to be something entirely different, but there's still hurt from that there. And him going to the dig would be that solace that he was looking for. That would have been the story I would have done. And that was the interesting story of this movie. But they give you like 45 minutes of other stuff that just is not that compelling.
It wasn't really compelling. It was kind of more like, oh, that's neat. But I'd really like to get back to Warshaw because I think Warshaw's story is more fascinating.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's kind of funny because the one man who's kind of like the landfill expert, they kind of tried to make this story like he was sort of like an urban Indiana Jones sort of archaeologist.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I get it. He has most of the landfill mapped out in his head and everything. I get that's cool, but that's not really interesting. I think the more interesting part of the story is just seeing Warshaw kind of going back to the one game that absolutely did a number on his career.
Absolutely. The dig thing is interesting for maybe a few minutes. After that, it's just kind of like, okay, yes, I get it. You have to go through all this red tape. You have to deal with the politics. You have to go through city councils. Like, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter in this. It's not that interesting at all. I guess we're kind of in agreement here. It just seems like the real story is Warshaw and what this game did to him, and what it would be to him to go to this dig and find this. But the rest of it is just not necessary. Especially the Klein sections. Like, why? Was the only reason why they had Ernest Klein in there is because they would have George R.R. Martin in the scene? Is that really what happened?
Yeah, it just seems like we want to kind of like shoehorn some big celebrities in here. Who's a celebrity who's either going to this dig or who's going to be really fascinated with the unearthing of the ET cartridges? Ernest Klein's a big video game guy. Okay, yeah, sure. Oh, he's going there? Wow, what a coincidence. And then you have the one part where Ernest Klein's like, yeah, I'm actually on my way to the dig and I need to pick up my DeLorean because cool retro car, right?
Yeah.
And, it happens that George R.R. Martin was borrowing my car to go to the Back to the Future screening, so yeah, I guess that's a thing. And it's just like, I get it, it's kind of a cute cameo of George R.R. Martin, but can we go back to kind of the historical significance on E.T., this whole burial thing, on the business, on why it's being buried? Because I think that's really the more fascinating story. I would like to kind of learn more about the business stuff, especially since, for me, the video game crash of the late 70s and early 80s is a topic that I am utterly fascinated with, mostly just because of just how crazy it was. And then during this moment, Nintendo was also trying to make a break into the console gaming market.
Yeah.
And it's just such an interesting time, and I just wanted to get more details on the Atari crash. This movie just kind of skipped over it like as if you're already supposed to know.
I will say I agree with you how the film tries to make everything seem more important than it is. I think that doesn't work, and the attempts at humor in this movie just don't work. They just feel like really stupid. It just was like, okay, guys, come on. Like, this is not that important. This is just like an interesting kind of quirky thing. They kind of try to make it out, oh, this is this huge historical. No, it's not. Stop it. Like, it's really not. It's interesting. It's a little weird, but it's not that important. All right, Zero, that is it. That's all we have to say. So overall, Zero, do you recommend this movie?
I do recommend it, but only if you have a interest or appreciation in video game history, even though this is kind of on the lighter side. There are so many more better books that really go into details if you're really interested in just kind of the background on the video game industry and everything, especially with regards to stuff like Atari. There was one book I have been reading on and off for the last couple of years, and it provided some excellent detail on the video game crash. I'm trying to remember it, but I don't think I'll be able to.
Yeah, I'm gonna say I can't recommend this movie, and the reason really is because the only interesting thing about this movie is about maybe a third of the movie, and the rest just seems like filler. I really think that the best way that you can watch this movie is if someone made a supercut of all the Warshaw parts and put it in a YouTube video. Watch that. Don't watch the rest of this movie. It really isn't all that interesting. interesting. I do agree in your case where you say it's more like a light video game history thing, where if you are interested in that and you know nothing about this, then okay, fine, give it a shot. But I think there are much more interesting videos on YouTube you can find, or books like you just mentioned, that you can get more information out of it that might be more entertaining than this. And on top of that, I
just remembered the book.
Go ahead.
The book that I would recommend people who have a more serious appreciation for video games, instead of watching Atari Game Over, would be Stephen L. Kent's book, The Ultimate History of Video Games. There is a new edition from what it looks like, where they actually split it into 2 volumes, it looks like. I know I got, maybe mine's the newer edition, I don't know, but I know the one that I have is a single book, whereas I'm seeing listings for one that is split over 2 books. The book covers a lot of history, and the details on the video game crash of the early 80s to late 70s is really detailed in this book. If you do end up watching Atari Game Over and you're left feeling wanting, I would really highly suggest that you seek out a copy of The Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent.
Okay, that's interesting. I might actually go and grab that or get it on Kindle, so I'll check that out. Zero, do you recommend Atari Game Over?
Yes, but with a very limited scope on why.
So you very limitedly recommend it. I do not recommend Atari Game Over. It is free literally anywhere. So if you go on to YouTube, you go to Tubi, Roku, and I watch it on Amazon, it's available for free with no ads. So if you are interested and want to spend an hour on that, check that out wherever you can. Now, if you want my full review on this movie, you can go to my website at IamTheWiz.com. You'll have my full written review right on the site, along with a link to the video that has this review that you've just listened to. Thank you for listening to this review. If you want to know what we're reviewing in the next couple of days, you can look on the screen right now to see what's coming up next. If you like what you heard, go ahead and leave a like on this video. If you want to discuss your opinion on the film or the review itself, please leave a comment. And if you want to hear more, subscribe to the channel. Thank you again for listening. I will talk to you next time.